Welcome to Someone's Gotta Drive. I want to put a trigger warning out there that this podcast does contain sexual content, domestic violence, drug addiction, parental drug addiction, and more. While this podcast may be validating to some, it can also be triggering at the same time. Today I'm recording a special episode, more specifically because it marks the anniversary of my mother's death. And so I kind of want to do a little bit of a shout out to her, to the woman who loves Stevie Nicks and would often be our biggest cheerleader, was also the woman who gave us the most grief and the most hell. And that's going to be the case, I feel, in any parental relationship. In my family, we do have a few people who have a mother with an addiction problem. And I keep telling everybody that my story is more common than you may think. And sometimes it feels like it's more common in just simply my own family, because we have parents who are addicts of some way, shape, or form, and we're the children that are trying to lead the better lives and break the cycles. But the other day I went to the doctor for my yearly physical, and he asked me, "So what have you been doing on maternity? Have you just been staying home? Are you exercising?" And I said, "I started a podcast." And I told him that it's about growing up with a mom who was an addict and ended up with a husband who ended up being an addict, and how I got out of those situations and how I lived through those situations. And he looked at me and said, "Your story is a lot more common than you may think." And I'm like, that's the point behind this. And the point behind this was all stemmed and started from my mother. So today I want to give a little bit of a special episode to her and kind of go over some of those extremely odd emotions that we go through. The ones where you kind of actually do miss them. The ones where, no, you don't hate them. You do still love them dearly. And if anything, you feel extremely hurt by them. I have a cousin of mine who has a mother who has got severe addiction problems, and her mother is still alive. And she is currently trying to figure out a way that she can take care of her mother, take care of her family. And her mother in particular, the drugs have eaten away at her stomach, her intestines, her brain. Like, she doesn't even recognize herself anymore, and is currently in like a kind of group home, kind of like a nursing home, but not like a nursing home. It's more of a group home, but they still care for her, and she's 3 hours away. And so, in her situation, her children know that they have a grandmother. They know grandma is sick, but they don't understand anything. They know that mom's childhood wasn't really great, but she doesn't really let that pour into her life now. She tries to live a completely separate life, so that way her kids don't experience the things that she experienced. However, we're still very vocal about the fact that addiction runs in our family. I have a niece who, my sister, she has stage 4 metastatic breast cancer and has used this to get money from people and say, like, I can't work, I can't provide for my child, and has since gotten a new wife and a new family. But that new wife and family just, my niece doesn't really fit in with them. And it's a really hard family dynamic where my niece feels like my sister has gotten a new family, discarded her, and my niece feels very much shut out, shunned, but at the same time not treated well. And my niece, I believe it was never diagnosed, but I do believe my niece had suffered from Munchausen syndrome, where my sister would tell doctors, oh, she is bipolar, she has these mental disabilities, when really she was a normal 15-year-old. She was a normal teenager. She had wonderful grades, but she was homeschooled because she was constantly made fun of and had issues socially with other people. And because of that, my sister would then have her put on these medications. It was this never-ending cycle. And in our family, we see how addiction has spread in different ways. But now for my niece, who no longer lives at home with mom and lives on her own, she has since gotten off of all of those medications, like the anti-anxieties, the lithium, and all the other things that you could possibly think of. And she definitely lives a much more clearer life. And she looks back and says, I didn't want to be on those medications. My mother made an excuse and had me put on them. And, it's one of those things where, once again, we see it in our family, but these stories are much more common than you think. But I started this podcast because of my mom, because of the way I was raised. And my story is even different than my sister's story. I have another sister who's 8 years older than me, and her story is even different. But my mother, at the end of the day, we didn't hate her. We loved her. And my niece asked me earlier today, she said, I'm having a really hard time with these emotions. And so many people say I should hate my mom, but I don't hate my mom. I don't hate my mom either. And I don't hate my dad either. I don't hate any of my parents. I love them dearly. I am sad sometimes that they're missing out, but those were also their decisions. My mother's medical problems, at the end of the day, were self-induced. She didn't get some disease that caused her lungs to fail. She smoked 3 packs of cigarettes a day for decades. That's what helped cause her lungs to fail. She refused to take her TPN at the end of her life. And that's what started causing her organs to fail, because she didn't have enough nutrition going into her system. She proceeded to snort 210 milligrams of Oxycontin a day up her nose for an extremely long time, which helped kill her small intestines. She didn't have something like Crohn's disease or something naturally that caused these issues. They were self-induced. And while I can tell you stories about how she has slammed me into walls and, called me names and kicked me out of the house 2 weeks before graduation, there were also times where we would go for joyrides. There were times where we would go for a hike to a waterfall. There were times where, we had good times and good vacations. But sometimes the bad still outweighs the good. She loved to paint. And as I look at my toddler who loves to paint, I think to myself, man, my mom would have loved to have seen that. When I look at how beautiful my children are and people sit there and tell me, you make beautiful children, I can just think to myself, the one thing my mom would say is, of all the things I screwed up in life, the one thing I didn't screw up was making beautiful children. And she would have thought the same thing about my children. And while there are moments where I really wish that she could hold my children and get to see them and coo and talk to them, I also know that she couldn't stay sober long enough to not be nodding out or to not drop a cigarette. That was my biggest fear ever, was I was going to have a child. She was going to hold that child in her arms, and then she would drop a cigarette on them, burning them. And then I wouldn't be allowed to let them come over. And it's almost like I can hear the conversation going on in my head. Why aren't you coming to see me? Why can't I see my grandchildren? Why can't I hold my grandchildren? And you're going to have to be that person that says, because you hurt them in ways that maybe you've never hurt me, but I can't have you dropping cigarettes on them, and I can't have you dropping them while you're nodding out. Like it, things like that. Because while that person is nodding out. What is an hour to you seems like 5 minutes to them because they're not coherent. And while I was raised that this was normal and that this was acceptable and that we should accept people for who they are and the addictions that they may have, I don't want to raise my children that way. And that may sound selfish, but that is part of breaking the cycle of teaching my children that the way drug addicts behave, whether it's the nodding out, the selfishness about the addiction itself, things like that, are really unacceptable. Because I want to teach my children to be sympathetic and empathetic, but I also want to teach them that there are certain behaviors that will not be accepted or tolerated, whether in our household or in general society. But what I do want to teach my children is that their grandmother loved Stevie Nicks, and she loved to swim, and she loved to paint. And that through all of the addictions, the end all be all was that she just wanted to have fun. And I want to teach my kids how to have fun and how to be active. And I don't want them to have idle hands, because they always say idle hands do the devil's work. And I don't want them like me sitting in a room of four walls with nothing to do, with no music and nothing to entertain myself. And then when that happened, then my parents said, well, what happened to you? You literally broke me. And I don't want to break my children. I want to watch them grow and aspire to the dreams that they have. And I want to help them, prepare them for life, not charge them rent and make them go out into the world poor and broke, not on their own volition, I didn't have that option. I want to make sure that my kids have the option to go to college and to do the things that they want to do in life. I want my niece to know that her story too is common, and that we're all trying to work through and break the cycle, and that we're here for her as well. So that way she knows that if she ever needs anything and she ever feels like she can't go home, she always has a home here. And while 12 years ago was the day that we lost my mom and watched her die a tragic and gruesome death, it was what she asked for. It was what she wanted. And it was the day my life changed, and actually for the good. I had no reason to stay in Maryland anymore. I had no reason to put up with anything. And for some reason, when it's your parent, you're just like, you don't get to choose your parents. So this is it. This is the only mom you're going to get. You have to deal with it. It is what it is. Where, when it's a spouse or someone else in your life, you're like, I don't got to deal with this anymore. And so the second my mother passed away, I didn't think it then, but now I look back and go, the second my mother passed away was the second my whole life changed. And yeah, I went through a lot of shit and I went through a lot of crap to get out of Maryland. And my story will give you that. But the day she died was the day my life changed forever. She answered prayers. And, looking back, the moment someone dies, whatever fight you had, whatever the issue was, it no longer matters because it no longer exists. All the fights that we had no longer meant anything. Who won? It didn't matter because she wasn't here anymore. At that point, the only thing that mattered was, say, the blanket that she crocheted for me, or a recipe that she left for me, or a voicemail that said happy birthday, because I was the last voicemail I would ever get. And the range of emotions that you end up getting in these situations are happy and sad and angry, because you're happy for the life that you live now. It's much better. You're sad because you do miss them. You miss I wouldn't say the sober part of them, but the part that wasn't completely inebriated at every second. There were times where she had lucid moments, but also angry, because you know that no matter how much you want them to be here and to witness the children and to witness this wonderful life, you also know that that would have never been a reality. That was a dream that you have had your whole life that was simply never coming true. The first few years of the anniversary of my mother's passing, I would send my sister some flowers, chocolates, balloons, something like that, just to let her know that I was thinking of her. It was, the death of my mom was a little harder on my sister than it was on me. And I think part of it was that she just, at the end, she was like, we can save her, we can save her. And, she really did look at my mom as just a sick woman. I had always looked at my mother as, yeah, she's a sick woman, but she did also bring this upon herself. And it wasn't this was supposed to happen to her. I knew what my mother's wishes were. She had looked at me numerous times and said, why did you let me live? And I knew that we were coming to a point at the end of her life where she just didn't want to live anymore. And we were about to be forced to do the thing that we didn't want to do, which was essentially legally kill her by using morphine. And my sister, by the end of my mother's life, had actually stopped working altogether and was taking care of both my mother and her father full time. After a while, I kind of stopped giving the flowers. One of the reasons why was because, honestly, I started forgetting the day. All of a sudden, the day would happen, and it would just be another normal day. And then I would look back and go, oh, that was Mom's anniversary yesterday. And I'd be like, I'm sorry, I didn't send you flowers. The flowers was never expected, but after a while, I just kind of felt like the more we celebrate to a certain degree that day, the more that we are reminded of what that day entailed. And that day was kind of a crappy, tragic day. And so maybe we don't want to remember it, or maybe we do just we know it happened, but we can't keep dwelling on the past. However, my sister and I love to have our moments where we chat back and forth about the past. I remember this. I remember that. I remember Oma making me eat rotten cantaloupe because she was like, it's still good, eat it, but it was the most disgusting thing in the world. We have our moments where we trauma drop on each other, and we're just like, hey, do you remember when this happened? I remember that. I remember this. But my mom's death has started to become a day that I don't really want to remember anymore. I've had way too many nightmares of that day, and I don't want to keep having them. And for my children's sake, I don't want them seeing me sad about a day that I honestly had no control over. It's time to move on. So while my podcast is going to talk about things that aren't savory and sometimes paint my mother in a bad light, remember that things weren't always bad. Sometimes they were good. Sometimes they were great. Sometimes they weren't. But she was a woman who loved to swim, who loved Stevie Nicks and going to concerts and having fun. She loved to paint. She loved to ride on the back of a motorcycle. She loved to drink. But today is a day where I do want to highlight some of the things that she loved to do. Not just the drugs and alcohol, but the other things that made her who she was. Let's remember that the cycle doesn't break overnight and decisions don't happen in a day. The day that she died was the day I couldn't listen to certain songs anymore. And 12 years later, some songs I can still not listen to, and others I'm finally starting to come back around to. The point behind this podcast is to tell you my story. But not just to tell you my story, but to continue on telling you how my day-to-day life is impacted by my story, and how I'm trying my best to move forward from my past, break the cycle, and give my children the better life that they deserve, and to give myself the better life that I've always deserved.